February 24th, 1983, Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. After receiving a temporary furlough from the county jail, 21-year-old Don Decker attends his grandfather's funeral and goes to stay at a friend's house. It isn't long before Don appears to go into a trance and water starts materializing from the house's walls, ceiling, and floor. Over the course of the next several days, Don seemingly makes water appear at a number of different locations, including a pizza parlor and the county jail, and numerous eyewitnesses report seeing strange supernatural events which make them believe that Don is possessed by an evil spirit. After a meeting between Don and a reverend, the strange occurrences finally come to an end, and there are no further incidents involving water, but no explanation can be found for the bizarre saga of Don Rainboy Decker. After that, the trail went dry. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Dry. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we have reached an historic milestone this week. This is our 168th feature-length episode, and when you combine that with the 32 minisodes we've also released, I guess that means today's show officially marks the 200th episode we've ever produced. And to commemorate the milestone, we are going to be presenting what is undoubtedly the scariest, most disturbing, most nightmare-inducing case we've ever covered. The saga of Don Decker, aka Rainboy. Yes, this is the untold story of the unproduced prequel to the Oscar-winning Dustin Hoffman-Tom Cruise film, Rain Man. Okay, not really. If you're an Unsolved Mysteries fan, you've probably heard of this one before, and remember it as the story about the guy who supposedly had the ability to use his mind to generate water and make it rain indoors. By pure happenstance, the release date of our 200th episode just happens to be April the 1st, and well, it would be downright foolish for us not to cover this case. You see, back in February, I released a bonus episode on Patreon about my top 10 biggest Unsolved Mysteries guilty pleasures, and ranked this segment right at the very top. But then I thought to myself, I could probably devote an entire episode to this story. I mean, given that the world is in a stressful, chaotic place right now, I thought it would be an ideal time to cover a more silly, lightweight mystery in which no one was actually harmed, but I'm sure some of you probably believe this story seems absolutely ridiculous, and you're probably wondering why I would waste my time covering such an obvious hoax. Well, you're right, this story does seem pretty ridiculous, but here's the thing. If this was a hoax, how in the world did they pull it off? I mean, what makes this one stand out from other paranormal cases is that we have several eyewitnesses who were in the presence of Don Decker at a number of different locations and were willing to go on the record to state that they witnessed this mysterious indoor rain as well as some other weird supernatural events. And these witnesses include no less than 4 seemingly level-headed police officers who come across as pretty sincere and believable. Since the basic premise is pretty absurd, we're going to have some fun on today's episode, but I'm not going to skimp on the theories and analysis section. Since it's hard to come up with a logical explanation for certain aspects of the story, it does deserve a serious analysis, so even if you're a complete skeptic about the paranormal, I hope you'll still find this episode interesting. I should also offer a disclaimer that in addition to Unsolved Mysteries, this story was also featured on an episode of the TV series Paranormal Witness, but unfortunately, both shows contain some contradictory information about certain details, so I'll try to address any inconsistencies which pop up in this account. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that this show is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the bizarre saga of Don Rainboy Decker. Our story begins in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania in 1983. Our central figure is 21-year-old Don Decker, who is currently serving a 4 to 12 month sentence at the Monroe County Correctional Facility for receiving stolen property. However, following the death of his 63-year-old grandfather, James Kishpaw, from cirrhosis of the liver, Don is granted a temporary furlough and is released from jail to attend the funeral. The funeral would take place on February the 24th, but would be a scene of mixed emotions for Don, because even though his grandfather's life was being celebrated, everyone else was completely unaware that James had physically abused Don since he was 7 years old. When the funeral concluded, Don went to stay at the rented home of his friends, Bob and Jeannie Kiefer. While the Kiefers prepared for dinner, Don went into the upstairs bathroom to wash his hands, but would claim that the room suddenly became cold and he felt a strange feeling come over him. According to Don, an unknown force knocked him to the floor, and he experienced what he described as a vision of an old man wearing a crown in the window before 3 scratches appeared on Don's arm. When Don went downstairs to have dinner with the Kiefers, they noticed the scratches, but Don swore they were not self-inflicted and told them about his vision. After dinner, Don was sitting in the living room when he claimed he suddenly felt himself being taken over by negative feelings from his grandfather's funeral and experienced a deep chill go through him. After the room became cold, a strange series of events started taking place, and the Kiefers would later say that Don appeared to be in some sort of trance while all this was going on. After hearing an unexplained loud noise from above them, Bob and Jeannie noticed that water started to drip from both the living room ceiling and the walls. Bob said that when he touched the liquid, it had a sticky, oily feel, which made him think it might not actually be water. Regardless, the Kiefers figured it was some sort of leak or plumbing problem, so they decided to contact their landlord, Ron Van Wy. When Ron arrived at the house, he was left completely baffled, as the only pipes were in the kitchen and the bathroom, and there were none of them above the living room. It was also not raining outside at the time, and there had been no rain in the area for several days. Incredibly, not only was water dripping down from the ceiling and the walls, but it had also started materializing and coming up from the floor as well, even though there didn't appear to be any source for the water to originate from. Ron decided to phone his wife Romaine, who soon arrived at the house, but the indoor rain showed no signs of letting up. Since everyone was at a complete loss about what to do, Bob eventually decided that they should inform the police about what was going on. So he called the Stroudsburg Police Department and spoke to John Bojan, an officer he personally knew, and asked him to come to the house. Bojan soon showed up alongside his partner, Richard Wolbert, but when they entered the house, they were completely baffled by what they saw. In addition to the dripping water, the 2 officers would claim they witnessed a water drop traveling horizontally through the air between them before it entered the kitchen. At this point, the water was still only dripping inside the living room and had not appeared in any other sections of the house. Bojan and Wolbert had no idea how to handle the situation, so they told everyone they were going to leave and go find the Stroudsburg police chief. Now, all the different sources about this case give conflicting details about the timeline, but according to the Unsolved Mysteries segment, the following event did not occur until 23 hours after the water originally appeared. Having not eaten in a long time, Bob and Jeannie decided to take Don across the street to a pizza parlor, while Ron and Romaine remained at the house. According to the Van Wys, almost immediately after they left, the dripping water suddenly came to a halt. When Don and the Kiefers entered the pizza parlor, they were greeted by the owner, Pam Scrofano, who had apparently visited the Kiefer residence earlier that day and seen the indoor rain. They all sat down at a table together, while Dawn continued to remain in a strange trance-like state, and Pam would later say she was convinced that Dawn had become possessed by an evil spirit. Well, sure enough, it wasn't long before water suddenly started appearing out of nowhere and dripping down onto everyone from the pizza parlor ceiling. Pam became so frightened that she actually went to the cash register to grab a crucifix. She placed it around Don's neck, but he said it started burning his skin. Don and the Kiefers quickly left the pizza parlor, but Pam said the dripping water came to a complete stop after they disappeared. And when they arrived back at the Kiefer residence, the indoor rain started up again in the living room. By this point, everyone now believed that Don was somehow responsible for the unexplained rain and that it was following him. Don was confronted by Jeannie and Romaine in the kitchen, who demanded that he make everything stop, but while they were yelling at him, a bunch of pots and pans started rattling. It was here that Don was suddenly levitated into the air before he was violently thrown down onto the floor by an unknown force. When Don recovered, he noticed that in addition to the original scratches on his right arm, he now had new scratches which had been carved in the shape of a crown. Shortly thereafter, Officers Wolbert and Bo Jan finally returned to the house with the Stroudsburg police chief, Gary Roberts. Even though Roberts was immediately pelted with water when he walked inside, he remained convinced that the issue was nothing more than a plumbing problem and chastised the two officers for wasting his time. He ordered Bo Jan and Wolbert to leave the scene and not file a report or speak about what happened. Well, in spite of this, Wolbert and Bo Jan told some of their fellow officers about the incident, and two veterans, William Davies and John Rundle, would show up at the Kiefer residence the following day. They took Don into a separate room away from the water in order to perform an experiment, and even placed a paper bag over his head to ensure that he wasn't using spit to fake the whole thing. Officer Davies then decided to place a rosary containing a gold cross in Don's hand, but Don immediately cried out that it was burning him and dropped it. When Davies picked the rosary up, he said it had suddenly become hot and there were now burn marks on the cross. The officers then said they witnessed Don suddenly levitate off the floor and fly across the room into a wall. When they went to check on him, they noticed that 3 fresh bloody claw marks were now on the side of Don's neck. By this point, Ron Van Wy was attempting to contact every Protestant minister and Catholic priest in the area to see if one of them would perform an exorcism on Don. They all refused to do so, but Ron finally found a Philadelphia-based evangelical pastor named Justina Hall who was willing to come to the house that night. The Van Wys and the Kiefers stood back and watched Hall start praying over Don while he was laying on the couch, and he began shaking and going into convulsions. As the exorcism continued, the dripping water finally started disappearing from the house. Don's body relaxed, and he seemed to become normal again, so everyone now believed that the mysterious force which had possessed Don was now gone. The Kiefers would experience no more incidents of indoor rain inside their home, and now that Don's temporary furlough had come to an end, he was returned to the Monroe County Correctional Facility in order to finish serving out a sentence. But this was not the end of the story. After Don arrived at the jail, he was placed inside a maximum security cell with another inmate, but only a few days later, Don said he started having thoughts about making it rain again. Sure enough, water started materializing out of nowhere from the ceiling and the concrete floor, and it even seemed to be moving upwards on the cell walls and flying sideways through the air. This freaked out Don's cellmate, prompting him to yell for help, and when a guard arrived and opened the door, he was shocked to discover that the cell was now flooded with water. Don would claim that he now realized he had the ability to control rain with his mind and make water appear at will. The story goes that one of the guards responded to this by daring Don to make it rain inside the office of the jail's warden, Dave Keenhold. Well, at around this moment, Keenhold was alone inside his office doing paperwork at his desk when a guard soon entered to let him know about the incident in Don's cell. It was here that the guard told Keenhold there was something on his shirt, and Keenhold finally noticed that a pool of water about 4 inches long and 2 inches wide had seemingly appeared out of nowhere at the center of his sternum. When Keenhold called a plumber and asked him to check out Don's cell, The plumber reportedly went inside and immediately walked back out. He apparently seemed quite unnerved by what he saw and said, quote, "Don't call me for this kind of stuff." By this point, word had spread throughout the jail about the strange incidents which had taken place during Don's furlough, so Keenhold decided to arrange a private meeting in a storage closet between Don and the jail's chaplain, Reverend William Blackburn. When Don spoke with Reverend Blackburn, he told him that he now had the ability to make it rain, and that if he ever touched a cross, it would burn his body. Blackburn openly expressed his skepticism, but then said he noticed an awful smell enter the room. By this point, the demeanor on Don's face had changed, so he raised up his hand and rubbed his fingers together. Not only did it start raining from the ceiling, but a mist suddenly appeared out of nowhere. This prompted Blackburn to open up his Bible and start reading a passage out loud, but he noticed that even though water was dripping all around him, the Bible's pages never got wet. After Blackburn spent some time praying, the rain finally came to a stop and the water disappeared. Blackburn said that Don appeared to be his normal self again, and tears started welling up in Don's eyes. He thanked the Reverend and hugged him before they prayed together, and they both seemed to think that Don had been possessed by something which was now driven out of him. After this, there would be no further incidents of indoor rain in Don's presence again. Don eventually completed his jail sentence and went back to living a normal life again, but came to believe that the strange phenomena was somehow connected to the death of his grandfather, who had managed to find a way to continue abusing him from beyond the grave. The story eventually captured the attention of Unsolved Mysteries, who produced a segment about this story titled Rainboy, and the episode would air around the 10th anniversary of these events in February of 1993. Years later, the segment would be featured on the commercial release of an Unsolved Mysteries DVD set, and it contained an alternate commentary track by the segment's director, David Vassar, who shared a very bizarre story. According to Vassar, he and the rest of the Unsolved Mysteries crew traveled to Stroudsburg to film this segment, and after the last day of shooting, they retired to their respective hotel rooms. The following morning, they each woke up to discover that a half-inch of water had now appeared on their floors. No one could figure out where this water came from, and none of the other rooms at the hotel experienced this issue. Like I mentioned in the intro, in November of 2011, the story would also be featured on an episode of the Sci-Fi Channel TV series Paranormal Witness, but there would soon be a final ironic postscript to this whole story. In October of 2012, Don Decker found himself in trouble with the law again after the owner of an establishment named Dana's Restaurant and Tavern paid Don to burn down his restaurant so he could collect the insurance money. Yep, you heard that right. Rainboy wound up getting charged with the crime of arson. So I guess you could say, the trail went dry. Okay, so obviously this was quite different from our usual episode of the podcast, as we don't normally do paranormal stories. Not that I don't have an interest in the subject, but I just find that the format of our show often doesn't give us a lot to talk about, as all you can really discuss is whether or not you believe these paranormal experiences actually happened. But the Rainboy saga is a truly one-of-a-kind mystery, and I've never seen anything quite like it. Given the circumstances, I could have just treated this story as a joke and spent the entire episode poking fun of the whole thing, but I legitimately believe that it deserves a lot of thoughtful analysis. Yes, I'm sure there are some people who will say that this was one of the silliest stories ever featured on Unsolved Mysteries, and that they never should have wasted airtime on it. During the early seasons of the show, it was standard practice for them to mostly focus on unsolved crimes and lost love stories, and then throw in the odd paranormal segment every now and then for variety. But in the mid-1990s, the series started to make a major shift and became oversaturated with stories like this, and on some episodes, you were lucky to even get one true crime segment. I will admit that the Rainboy segment is incredibly campy and over the top, so after watching it, I can see why someone would be unable to take this story seriously. But Unsolved Mysteries certainly did not skimp on giving this story their full attention, and at over 20 minutes long, it's one of their longest segments. During his DVD commentary track, David Vassar stated that this was one of the most expensive segments the show ever produced because they had to do things like build their own house so they could film scenes of the interior getting pelted with water. In fact, the segment was affectionately referred to around the office as Raingate, in homage to the infamous Hollywood flop Heaven's Gate, a movie which cost so much money to make that it wound up bankrupting its studio, United Artists. Oh, and here is one more interesting piece of trivia about the Unsolved Mysteries segment. If you watch the reenactment of the grandfather's funeral, you'll notice that the actor portraying Don Decker is sitting next to a middle-aged woman who was apparently cast to play his mother. Well, you may recognize her as Karen Lynn Gorney, who played the major role of John Travolta's love interest / dance partner, Stephanie Mangano, in the 1977 blockbuster Saturday Night Fever. Even though the film was a smash hit, Gorney soon took a long hiatus from acting before she attempted a comeback in the early 1990s, so this is a rare example of an actor appearing in an Unsolved Mysteries reenactment after they had already established themselves. Oddly, Gorney does not even have any lines during the segment and is only on screen for a few seconds, so I have to wonder if they filmed some material with her which got left on the cutting room floor. But hey, I never thought I'd ever be discussing an Unsolved Mysteries Saturday Night Fever crossover, but here we are. Anyway, as campy as the Unsolved Mysteries segment might be, it's actually a model of subtlety and restraint when compared to the Paranormal Witness episode, but we'll talk more about that momentarily. In spite of all the inherent silliness surrounding the story, here's the main reason I find it so fascinating. The sheer number of eyewitnesses who are willing to go on the record and state with the utmost sincerity that these events really happened. In addition to Don Decker, there were no less than 9 people who were willing to be interviewed on camera during the Unsolved Mysteries segment to describe these paranormal experiences they witness. They include Ron Van Wy, the landlord of the house where the indoor rain took place, his wife Romaine Van Wy, Pam Scrofano, the owner of the pizza parlor which also experienced indoor rain, Reverend William Blackburn, who supposedly drove an evil spirit out of Don's body and stopped his ability to control water, Dave Keenholt, the warden at the county jail where Don was being held, and 4 Stroudsburg police officers, John Bojan, Richard Wolbert, William Davies, and John Rundle. Now let's go through each of these witnesses one by one. Sure, Ron and Romaine Van Wy could have been lying about what they saw, but let's not forget that Ron was the landlord of the house, which likely suffered considerable water damage because of these events. Unless Ron collected a considerable insurance payout for this, and I don't see any indication that he did, I'm not sure what motive he would have to perpetuate a hoax. It's also worth noting that the Kiefers continued living in the house for the next 2 years, and they were apparently unable to remove the stains which were caused by the water, which could have caused issues when Ron eventually rented out the house to another tenant. Whenever there's suspicion that someone is conducting a hoax, the number one question you have to ask is what the participants stand to gain by it. But as far as I can tell, neither the Kiefers or the Van Wys, or Don Decker for that matter, profited from this financially in any way. This wasn't like an Amityville situation where the people involved made a lot of money from publishing books or whatnot. This was an alleged paranormal experience that only a handful of people knew about and didn't get any mainstream coverage until it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries a whole decade after the fact. Now, I will admit that out of all the eyewitnesses, Pam Scrofano comes across as the most flaky, and does seem like she would have been susceptible to religious hysteria. After all, upon seeing water dripping from the ceiling of her pizza parlor, her first reaction was not to call a plumber or a roofer, but to grab a crucifix from inside her cash register. I mean, did she keep the crucifix in there at all times? Did she pull it out if the place was being robbed at gunpoint? I can also see why some people might be skeptical about the account from Reverend William Blackburn. He does come across as pretty sincere during the interview, and I doubt he was deliberately lying, but I won't deny the possibility that he could have exaggerated details of his story in order to build up his credibility as the reverend who managed to drive an evil spirit out of someone's body. Not saying that's what happened, but I can understand why some people might think that. I do think that Dave Keenhold, the jail warden, comes across as a fairly believable, down-to-earth guy, as he's not describing over-the-top events like rain falling from the ceiling. He simply states that a large patch of water suddenly appeared on his shirt while he was alone in his office, and he has no explanation for it. But the thing that really gives this story an extra aura of credibility are the accounts from the 4 police officers. To recap, 2 of them, John Bojan and Richard Wolbert, maintain that they witnessed all this unexplained rain inside the Kiefer's living room, and even went so far as to say they saw water traveling through the air horizontally. And the other 2 officers, William Davies and John Rundle, described seeing weird events like a cross burning Don's hand before he was propelled through the air across the room, and unexplained scratches suddenly appeared on his neck. Now, if you believe these guys aren't credible witnesses to a paranormal experience, then I don't know who is. By the time these officers appeared on Unsolved Mysteries, a full decade had passed since these events took place, and it's worth noting that they were all still on the force and dressed in full uniform when they recorded their interviews. So obviously, these aren't embittered former employees who were making up a story because their police careers didn't go anywhere. I've done online searches on all 4 of these officers and found nothing in their backgrounds to suggest that any of them had credibility issues. In fact, during Davies' interview, he stated with all sincerity that he had been a police officer for 40 years up until that point and never saw anything like that. Now, as silly as the Paranormal Witness episode might have been, a number of these same witnesses were still willing to appear on camera and be interviewed, including Dave Keenhold, Ron and Romaine Van Wy, and even Bill Kiefer was willing to go on record for the first time. But most importantly, the episode also contained a new interview with John Bojan, who not only stuck to the exact same story, but he had since been promoted to Stroud Area Regional Police Chief. So obviously, going on record about these paranormal events did not hamper Bojan's career. It's also worth mentioning that when the local media did a story about Don Decker's arrest for arson in 2012, they talked about his Unsolved Mysteries connection and conducted a new interview with Richard Wolbert. Once again, Wolbert still maintained that he saw what he saw and had no explanation for it. Now, I will acknowledge that the one eyewitness who was not willing to go on record and remained completely dismissive about everything he saw was Gary Roberts, the Stroudsburg police chief at that time. And I definitely would have welcomed seeing an interview with Roberts on either of these TV shows to hear his side of the story. But I get the impression that he was always considered a bit of an outsider and not a good fit for his role. Shortly after moving to Stroudsburg in 1981, Roberts was appointed police chief, becoming the first person in the town's history to hold that position without having moved up the ranks of the department. In November of 1984, less than 2 years after these events took place, Roberts resigned as police chief when he received a lower pay raise than he was expecting, as the borough council told him he was not performing his job satisfactorily. I mean, I don't know if this has any relevance to how Roberts handled the Rainboy situation, but I felt it was worth mentioning. During their Unsolved Mysteries interviews, Bojan and Wolbert stated that when the chief first entered the Kiefer residence and saw all the dripping water, they suspect that he may have felt that he was put on the spot and became embarrassed and uncomfortable over the fact that he was being asked to deal with a problem which he had no idea how to handle or explain. That might account for why Roberts was so dismissive of the whole situation and tried to write it all off as a simple plumbing issue. It's also worth noting that Roberts eventually entered the field of politics, and at the time the Unsolved Mysteries segment was being filmed, he was a candidate to run for mayor of Stroudsburg. So you can definitely see why he would have been reluctant to go on the record about this whole situation and stay as far away from it as possible. But I think it speaks volumes that 4 seemingly down-to-earth, straight-arrow police officers were so open-minded about this, so at the very least, I'm sure they legitimately believed they witnessed something paranormal and were not intentionally lying. During an online discussion about this story on Reddit, I saw a poster raise a very good point. If a police officer was willing to go on the record and say they witnessed a paranormal event, This could potentially cause serious damage to their credibility if they were asked to testify in a criminal case, because it might mean their observational skills couldn't be trusted. Indeed, I could just imagine a good defense attorney attempting to undermine one of these officers on the witness stand by stating, "Aren't you the same policeman who claimed that they once saw a demonically possessed kid make it rain indoors?" So once again, if all these officers were willing to publicly state that these events happened, you know the experience must have affected them in a huge way. Now, don't get me wrong, just because I find these eyewitnesses to be credible does not mean I believe that Satan himself entered Don Decker's body and gave him the ability to control water. I am willing to concede that Don himself is not exactly a bastion of credibility. At the time these events took place, he was serving a jail sentence for receiving stolen property, and he apparently went back to jail a couple years later for burglary. And of course, he obviously did not remain on the straight and narrow, since he was arrested again for arson in 2012. It sounds like Don had quite a troubled childhood, and that remaining silent about the abuse his grandfather inflicted on him took a severe psychological toll. But it is interesting how the Unsolved Mystery segment actually downplays the satanic aspects of the story, especially when compared to the Paranormal Witness episode, as it makes no mention of the incident in the bathroom where Don claimed he saw a demonic old man with a crown and scratches suddenly appeared on his arm. I do think that stuff does undermine the credibility of the story, as I think there's a good chance that Don's scratches were self-inflicted. And perhaps the incidents where witnesses saw Don levitate off the ground and fly across the room were just him jumping and propelling himself through the air. But I know what you're thinking. Even if Don faked some of these incidents, how could he possibly have made it rain indoors? Well, now we're going to get to the skeptics portion of this podcast. Shortly after this story was covered on Paranormal Witness, it captured the attention of Robert Bartholomew, a New York-born medical sociologist who is now teaching at Botany Downs Secondary College in New Zealand. Bartholomew often wrote about the paranormal in medical and sociology journals, so he decided to explore this case and put together a research report, which would be published in a 2013 issue of Skeptic magazine. Long story short, Bartholomew concluded that these entire series of events were an example of social delusion, and that the most likely explanation for the indoor rain was ice damming. This process can occur when warm air enters an enclosed attic space of a house and causes snow on the outer surface of the roof to melt. This will create an accumulation of ice, which forms pools of water that can leak. According to a report published by the Manufactured Housing Research Alliance, this is not an uncommon issue for homes in Pennsylvania during the wintertime. Less than 2 weeks before this particular incident took place, there actually had been a major snowstorm in Stroudsburg, and during that time period, weather records showed that there were daytime highs in the 40s and 50s and nighttime lows in the 20s and 30s. In Bartholomew's eyes, these kind of inconsistencies can cause ice damming to take place at night when the temperature drops, and he theorizes that the Kiefer's house had an accumulation which melted and leaked into their living room. Bartholomew also believed that the trance-like state Don appeared to be in may have been the result of extreme stress, due to the trauma of having lost a relative while in the midst of serving a jail sentence. In fact, he wondered why none of Don's friends attempted to get legitimate medical attention for him, rather than finding someone to perform an exorcism. Bartholomew believed that their perceptions may have been affected by their willingness to interpret natural events within a supernatural framework. The one point which made Bartholomew most skeptical about this story was the fact that none of the eyewitnesses to these events made any attempt to photograph or film them, or even contact a local TV station to document everything. I definitely believe that Bartholomew makes a lot of valid points, and that his write-up is probably the most logical explanation for these events I've seen. I do agree with his assertion that the story was highly sensationalized on Unsolved Mysteries and Paranormal Witness, and the fact that these two episodes sometimes provided details which contradicted each other lends credence to the idea that certain elements have been greatly exaggerated over time. All that being said, I do think there are details about this story which not even Bartholomew can adequately explain, but let's break this whole thing down. I think it's certainly possible that attending his grandfather's funeral triggered some sort of PTSD within Don that might account for some of his behavior over the next few days. I'm sure that attending the funeral for a man who secretly abused him and seeing everyone else celebrate his life must have been quite painful for Don and triggered something inside him. Now, I just made reference to contradictory details between the Unsolved Mysteries and Paranormal episodes, but one of the most interesting involves the circumstances of how Don wound up staying at the Kiefer residence. On Unsolved Mysteries, Robert Stack makes it sound like Don made that decision on his own because he could not stomach the way his parents glorified his grandfather. But during his paranormal witness interview, Bob Kiefer states that Don's mother wouldn't allow him to stay with her during his furlough, which is why he allowed Don to crash at his house. Whatever the circumstances, it seems like Don had some sort of conflict of interest with his family, which could have contributed to his stress. Don has always expressed his belief that these events were somehow caused by the evil spirit of his grandfather attempting to harm him from beyond the grave, and to be fair, he might legitimately believe that. But let's just assume that Don did all this on his own. I get the impression that both the Kiefers and Ron and Romaine Van Wy were very religious people who took their faith seriously, so if Don suddenly felt compelled to orchestrate some hoax about encountering the devil and being demonically possessed, he may have figured that these were the type of people who would buy it. This would explain why they felt calling an exorcist was a better option than calling a doctor. But here's my problem. If Robert Bartholomew's theory is correct, and all the dripping water inside the Kiefer residence was the result of ice damming, how could Don have possibly predicted that? Let's just say that Don decided to go into the bathroom before dinner, inflict some scratches on himself, and make up a story about an encounter with Satan in order to perpetuate a hoax. Doesn't it strike you as an astounding coincidence that immediately after dinner, water would then drip down into the living room due to a completely unrelated event? Did Don suddenly say to himself, "Hey, just my luck. Now I can make everyone believe that I did this"? I mean, it's certainly not impossible, but the odds of these events perfectly unfolding this way have to be astronomical. I do think the ice damming theory does make logical sense, and would explain how water wound up leaking into a room in which there were no pipes. But even though Bartholomew checked weather records to verify that there was a lot of snow in Stroudsburg in February of 1983, I'm not sure if he or anyone else could be certain there was an accumulation of snow and ice on top of the Kiefer's roof on that particular night, so his theory is based on pure speculation. I'd also like to think that a landlord like Ron Van Wy would have been aware of potential issues with ice damming and noticed if there was leaking on the roof. But then again, if Ron was a religious man, he could have been so caught up in the demonic possession hysteria that he never considered that possibility. Of course, if there was also water materializing through the floor, then that can't be explained by ice damming, but perhaps the whole situation was an example of confirmation bias in which the witnesses just saw what they wanted to see. But then again, even if the Kiefers and the Van Wys were taken over by religious hysteria, would the same thing have happened to the police officers? After all, if Bojan and Wolbert saw water traveling through the air horizontally through multiple rooms, that's another event which can't be explained by ice damming. One of the biggest points Bartholomew raises to debunk this whole situation is the fact that nobody attempted to film or photograph these events while they were taking place, which I can agree with to a point, but you also have to remember that this was 1983. This isn't the era when everyone was going to have a cell phone camera at their disposal to document everything, and it's not like every household was going to have a video camera on hand. In fact, the first camcorder was not even released until May of that year, months after these events took place. I guess it is a bit surprising that no photographs were ever taken of this water, as this was an age where instant Polaroid cameras were easily available, and it sounds like they had at least 3 days to document all this stuff. But we don't know if the Kiefers kept any cameras in their house at that time, and perhaps everyone was so terrified by these events that the thought of obtaining a camera never crossed their minds. I'm sure the police department would have had cameras on hand, but remember, the chief ordered his officers not to file a report or talk about the incident, so they may have felt that using one of the department's cameras to document this might cost them their jobs. Bartholomew also said that the witnesses should have contacted a TV station to document the events, but Stroudsburg is a small town of just over 5,000 people, so I'm not sure how many media outlets were at their disposal. The issue is that I do not get the impression that any of these people were interested in using this incident to make money or garner attention. They seem legitimately convinced that an evil spirit had taken over Don's body, and their top priority was to get rid of it. In a strange way, I almost feel like the lack of photographic or video evidence helps further the case that this wasn't a hoax, because it would have been so easy to stage an incident involving indoor rain and then sell the photos or the footage to the media if they were interested in monetary gain. But instead, Don Decker went on to appear on a grand total of 2 TV shows over the course of the next 3 years, so I don't get the impression he was trying to capitalize on the fame of being Rainboy. Of course, the biggest hole in the ice damming theory is that the indoor rain also took place in 2 other locations Don visited, the pizza parlor and the Monroe County Correctional Facility. Granted, the pizza parlor was directly across the street from the Kiefer residence, so it's not beyond the realm of possibility that they could have also experienced an accumulation of snow and ice on the roof, which wound up leaking through the ceiling. I mentioned earlier that the timeline of these events is a bit unclear, as most accounts of the story make it sound like the water appeared in the Kiefer residence and the pizza parlor on the same night. But during his narration on Unsolved Mysteries, Robert Stack states that Don and the Kiefers went to the pizza parlor 23 hours after the rain's first appearance, and that Pam Scrofano visited the house and personally witnessed the phenomenon earlier that day. So it's possible that Pam had let her hysteria get the better of her by that point, and automatically jumped to the conclusion that an innocent leak caused by ice damming meant the presence of evil had entered her establishment. However, both Ron and Romaine Van Wy claim that the moment Don left the house, the indoor rain suddenly came to a stop and did not start up again until he returned. And Pam Scrofano maintained that the rain inside the pizza parlor came to a halt after Don left. If all these people are telling the truth, and were not overtaken by hysteria, then I don't see how ice damming could selectively decide to leak water into a building based on whether a specific person was there or not. But most importantly, even if by chance, ice damming just happened to occur at the house and the pizza parlor while Don was there, what are the odds that such a thing would happen again at the county jail after he returned there a few days later? And even if this whole thing was an elaborate hoax, and Don was the mastermind behind the whole thing, how exactly could he have made water materialize from the ceiling and the floor of a maximum security jail cell? If Don caused that leaking by somehow ripping apart the plumbing, I'm sure someone would have noticed. I will acknowledge that while the Unsolved Mysteries episode gave off the impression that these incidents in the jail took everyone by complete surprise, the Paranormal Witness episode claims that by the time Don's furlough came to an end, word had already spread around the facility about what happened at the Kiefer residence and Don's so-called ability to make it rain. So theoretically, this could be another example of people's hysteria affecting their perceptions. For example, Dave Keenhold did not personally witness rain come out of the ceiling in his presence. He just claimed that a pool of water suddenly appeared on his sternum out of nowhere and made his shirt wet. During Keenhold's interview on the Paranormal Witness episode, he mentioned having finished an evening meal before this incident took place, and Robert Bartholomew has theorized that either Keenhold spilled something on his shirt during the meal without realizing it, or this pool of water was actually sweat. But since Keenhold was told about an incident involving leaking water in Don's cell, and the guards supposedly dared Don to make it rain in the warden's office, Keenhold became convinced that Don used his mind to produce water on his sternum. Indeed, it is kind of odd that all the other reported incidents involve dripping water, but this particular one involves a wet shirt. I will also acknowledge that the paranormal witness reenactment of the scene between Dawn and Reverend Blackburn is pretty ridiculous, especially in comparison with the Unsolved Mysteries segment. It probably helps that the Unsolved Mysteries version features an interview with Reverend Blackburn, who manages to keep things relatively down to earth, as he mentions a bit of dripping water and some strange mist inside the room, but once he started reading a passage from the Bible, the weird events finally came to an end. But Paranormal Witness, on the other hand, portrays the whole scene as a full-fledged exorcism, where Blackburn morphs into Father Merrin from The Exorcist, and a rainstorm starts falling from the ceiling. And this account of the events is strictly from Dawn himself, as I'm not sure Reverend Blackburn was even still around by that point. But you do get the sense that Dawn may have greatly exaggerated certain aspects of the story. So herein lies the big conundrum. Taken individually, the incidents at the Kiefer residence, the pizza parlor, and the county jail could probably each be debunked. But taken together, they're not so easy to explain. Could several witnesses from multiple locations, including a priest, a jail warden, and 4 police officers, all been experiencing the same social delusion and form of hysteria? I guess I should also address the story from David Vassar about how the Unsolved Mysteries crew allegedly found a half-inch of water on the floors of their respective hotel rooms right after they finished shooting the segment. When Vassar shared this on the DVD commentary track, he admitted that he's ordinarily a pretty skeptical guy, but had no explanation for how this event happened and why it only affected the specific rooms where the Unsolved Mysteries crew was staying. Of course, we only have Vassar's word that this incident happened, and it's possible he completely made the whole thing up. But remember, this is for a commentary track which was recorded over a decade after the segment originally aired. And at the time this DVD set came out, Unsolved Mysteries had already been cancelled, so it's not like Vassar would have had any reason to fabricate the story in order to generate publicity for the show or something. So I guess we can probably count him as yet another person who is willing to go on the record about witnessing an unexplained appearance of water, even though he had no real reason to lie. So overall, what are we to make of this whole situation? Well, I believe that Robert Bartholomew is probably correct about a number of things. I think that when Don attended his grandfather's funeral, it brought back all sorts of horrific memories of the abuse he suffered. Things eventually escalated to the point where Don fabricated a story, or perhaps he legitimately believed, that his grandfather's death caused him to be possessed by an evil spirit, which gave him the power to manipulate water. If the Kiefer residents did experience some ice damming and water started dripping into the living room, Don either exploited the situation to make people believe he was possessed, or the others were just overcome by social delusion and religious hysteria and let it get the better of them. But I don't know. I just feel like there are a few too many coincidences here to adequately explain everything and write off all these events as natural phenomena and hysteria. Once again, I just cannot get over for seemingly credible, level-headed police officers going on the record about what they saw and continuing to stick by their stories decades after the fact. I'm not saying that Don Decker should join the X-Men and they should do a reboot where Rainboy takes Storm's place, but I am willing to concede that something out of the ordinary might have happened of which there is no logical explanation. Even though I'm generally a pretty skeptical guy, I have to admit there are certain aspects of Rainboy which continue to stump me, and I really can't come up with a logical theory that accounts for everything. But regardless, if you happen to have any information about the saga of Don Rainboy Decker, please contact the appropriate... maybe not. Actually, if you happen to see Don Decker attempting to commit arson by burning down any more restaurants for insurance money, then yes, definitely contact the appropriate authorities. And if you happen to see large quantities of water suddenly dripping into your residence for unexplained reasons, please contact the appropriate plumber. Also, if you have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Anyway, another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, including that aforementioned episode about my top 10 unsolved mysteries guilty pleasures, for which I placed Rainboy at the top of the list. But my most recent bonus episode involves the bizarre saga of Julie Mott, a young woman who died of cystic fibrosis before her body was stolen from her casket at a funeral home, and it has still not been found. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Katie M, Ellie N, Hannah H, Sarah S, Michelle, Megan M, Amy H, Peter H, and Janet D. Thank you all so much for your support. And before we bring this episode to a close, I'd like to play a promo for another true crime podcast called Forensic Miles.
Hey guys, my name is Miles, and I am so excited to tell you about my true crime podcast, Forensic Miles. My co-host and I investigate the cases covered in every episode of Forensic Files. You've seen the show, you know the crime, but is there more to the story? Let's find out. Check us out on Instagram at Forensic Miles, Miles with a Y, or listen on Spotify or Anchor. See you there.
I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. Though to be quite honest, it was very difficult to resist the urge to hire Milli Vanilli to sing Blame It on the Rain for this episode. Anyway, if you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So that about brings an end to our 200th episode, and yes, if you hadn't figured it out already, since today is April the 1st, this was a special April Fool's Day edition of our podcast. But even though it might sound like I just made up this whole story, the saga of Rainboy actually happened. I sought to find a happy medium where I covered a more goofy mystery, but one that still opened itself up to a lot of theories and analysis, so even if you're a complete skeptic, I hope you still enjoyed this one. In all seriousness, this is a very difficult and challenging time right now because of the coronavirus, and at the time of this recording, the majority of the world is self-isolating and keeping themselves indoors. I sincerely hope we all get through this with as few people being harmed as possible. But regardless, being cooped up still gives me an abundance of time to work on my podcast, and I think that podcasts are a very important escape right now, since they are the one form of entertainment that not even a global pandemic can cancel. And even though this was a lightweight April Fool's Day episode, I still find it pretty overwhelming that we have now completed 200 of these things, and this never would have been possible without the immense support and loyalty of our wonderful listeners. So thank you all so much. Next week we'll be back to business as usual and covering another unsolved true crime case. So until then, stay safe and stay healthy, and be sure to join us for another new episode of The Trail Went Dry. Sorry, The Trail Went Cold.